So, hi everybody. My name is Cory Guynn. I am a solutions architect with Cisco Meraki. So I sit within the product team designing the next, say, APIs that we are going to be releasing with the Meraki cloud. So just before I kind of dive into this, I just want to kind of know the general audience I'm working with here. How many of you have heard of Cisco? All right, Cisco Meraki. Okay, cool. How many of you consider yourselves network engineers? All right, how about developers? Okay, that's my audience, all right. So today I am going to explain the API magic and applications on the network. Well, what does that really mean? I'm going to show you a bunch of toys and things that I've been building to learn and use APIs, and specifically as it applies to networking. So I consider APIs are bridging the gap between your classic network engineers and your application developers. So what does that exactly mean? Well, I wanted to understand what all of the development requirements and Internet of Things and networking and understand how they all communicate to each other. And so actually the founders of Meraki also went ahead and started an IoT company. And I was curious, I was like, well, what is IoT when it started? Like, well, what does this mean? And so I went around and I basically read all of the internet, right? I read everything from REST APIs to MQTT to Raspberry Pis, Arduino, understanding firmware code, understanding back-end code, understanding front-end code, all from really a network engineer's perspective, right? I mean, in college, I certainly took some Java courses. I took assembly, and then I stopped programming after that because assembly and C were not my most favorite things to do at the time. But what I did like was connecting the dots. So as computers were really getting started, I figured everyone's probably going to need a computer one day. And all of those computers are probably going to need to talk to each other, right? So when I was like 15 years old, I figured I'm going to go into networking because it feels like a safe bet, right? And I actually liked doing it. So fast forward, 10 years or more of network engineering, I was getting a little bit antsy, right? I was doing support, I was doing sales engineering, but I was either fixing other people's problems or I was selling the dream with a whole lot of analogies and theory, but I was like, I actually just want to build something, right? And so I took the time to, one, understand where networking and IoT and development meets. So that brings me to my Lego story here. So I basically bought a whole bunch of Legos. It started, my wife got me a Lego train set for Christmas like 3 or 4 years ago. Worst mistake. I was like, oh, I remember you. And I bought a lot of Legos. But to justify it, I bought a lot of Raspberry Pi so I could connect them together. So I had some research, research and development that I was doing. So ultimately what I did here is I tried to automate everything in this city using real-world technology, right? So how do I detect the weather in my room? I would actually build a small microcontroller with like a ESP8266, okay? So that's a really small microcontroller, but it has Wi-Fi on it. I also attached a small weather sensor on it, so it could detect my weather, my humidity, my temperature, all of that. So I take that information, and I wrote a little bit of firmware in C++ on the microcontroller. Again, I felt C++ was a little bit tedious for me, right? So what I did is I quickly tried to abstract that into a REST API as quickly as possible. So now that I have a REST API, I could then interface with that using a little bit more comfortable language for me. So JavaScript or Python or something like that. And from that point, I was able to start collecting data. And then I figured, well, if I can collect data from one sensor, I could probably collect it from other sensors. Or what if I reverse it? What if I push out a command, and now I can turn things on or off? Well, now I can control my Lego train by sending a signal to a little bit of firmware that I have running on a microcontroller. So then I figured, well, how do I extend that even further? So I was looking around, and I was trying to understand APIs and really what you can do with them. And I discovered that at the time I was living in London, and the Transport for London system offers an API. which means I could tap into the bus schedules, the train schedules, the tube, all of that. And I was like, well, that's kind of cool. So I pulled out the local train schedule for my train station across the street. And based on the time of those trains, I would then connect to my Lego train via Wi-Fi, via the firmware and the API I built for that. Then I also pulled that information out, created another microcontroller with a tiny little OLED screen on it so I could display the train schedule. So I put that in the train station, and then I could control the train, but that train could go 2 different ways. So then I tied that into a little servo that would switch to tracks. So now I have this giant Lego set in my living room, to my wife's displeasure. But the good thing was I could look up my train set and know if I'm actually going to make my train in time and when the next one is going to be here and which way it's going. Because I could, right? So I understood these concepts. And then I extended it, and I did a lot of other fun things. RFID detectors, weather stations, lighting systems. If people were to go visit my blog, which is internetoflego.com, I would actually have a little bit of JavaScript on there. So if you hit that page, it calls a REST command, which then triggers these marquee lights on my Palace Cinema, so I can tell when people are visiting my site. So just a lot of fun stuff I can do with that. So now that you kind of understand where I came from, this is how a network engineer learned development. You could kind of go the other way around. So to dive in deep of what this city looks like, basically, it consists of a Raspberry Pi, which is running Linux, like an Ubuntu version. I have my various electronics. I understood the concept of firmware versus an API. I understood about pub/sub using MQTT or other solutions out there. I understood how to kind of make a dashboard. And honestly, I used a lot of Lego to build this. Now, I kind of have a topology up here. You don't have to understand all of it, but effectively, I identify where I have GPIOs for firmware, so I can turn a switch on or off, right? Then I have an orchestration kind of system, and then I could send that data to other solutions using some various protocol. MQTT is a pretty popular one in the makerspace and all that. And so I kind of understood a little bit of all of these different components. So that kind of brings me to, network engineers. So through school and all my certifications, probably have like 10 or 11 certifications in networking. And it's things about like SNMP, syslog, TCP/IP, all that stuff is pretty commonplace. But unless you're a trained network engineer, you don't necessarily know how to make it work, right? I understand what an IP is, but I don't necessarily know how to get into some Cisco router to then type in the right commands so that I can change my access control list or something of that nature. Or pull out data using syslog or SNMP. These are very proprietary protocols, right? And you have to kind of know that discipline. So kind of fast forward, Meraki, as a general business, we wanted to change that entire concept, right? So we started basically by building the first cloud-managed network, right? So instead of you going into command lines and proprietary on-premise equipment, we basically have all of the equipment, access points, routers, switches, mobile device management, phones, cameras, and intelligence, and then we basically put that in the cloud. Before the cloud was like a buzzword, right? It was basically our servers running our website that allowed you to interface with our dashboard to control your systems. And you didn't have to tie in all this other equipment. So this worked really well for small and large businesses, but they had to have pretty regular requirements, okay? Where this started to fall apart was when I joined the service provider sales engineering team, and I realized service providers or really big enterprises are like, oh, that's a really pretty dashboard, but we have our own solution. How do we make our software talk to your software, right? And that's where we started investing in APIs, right? So I'm sure everyone here is familiar with APIs now. And so we basically are now creating APIs first to enable us to do two things. Refactor our own dashboard. Instead of this big monolith type application, now we use React with components. They talk to an API, they get the information, right? but it also allows our bigger customers and partners to build their own solutions on top of the Meraki platform using whatever language that they feel most comfortable. So now you don't have to learn, say, Cisco iOS. You just need to know Python or JavaScript and how to do HTTP requests. At that point, it's up to you, your developers, to build the solution, right? So now we have this bridge between a web developer and a network engineer, right? You may not know exactly how to design the network, but now you can design the interface to allow a network engineer to program it, right? So there's a lot of power there. So what can you do with the Meraki APIs? Well, you can automate things, right? An example of an automation where you may want to just provision a new customer, right? So someone calls in, I want to have a new network, give me like option 2. And so the receptionist would go in there and say, okay, I'm going to provision your network. Well, they don't have to be a network engineer now. They can simply select, plan B, this is their credit card information, this is the store location, whatever it is, and now you can automate that through some script that configures the network. But you may also want to think about automation as kind of a response to an event, right? So maybe I plug in a point-of-sale machine, a register, or maybe even an access point into a switch port. I can now use that activity of that switch port turning on to trigger some webhook. That webhook says this port on this switch is now enabled, right? It's turning on. I can query the details of that port and understand that, oh, I see a client with this MAC address, and that is in our database listed as a register system or a point-of-sale system. So now I can use an API to convert that switch port to the proper VLAN so that it has the right sort of security policy on it, and there you go. Now, just by the fact of plugging that device into a switch, I can use automation to provision it on demand, okay? A couple other things you can do is build apps, right? So you can build mobile apps to interface with the network, custom apps to abstract the network. So you may not want to give everybody access to our control system, right? It may be a third-party installer. It may be the local engineers on site, but you don't want to give them, all the access. So you can build your own apps for that. And then the other three tend to be more around the value add. So you already have a network out there, but now I can perform analysis on it. I might want to engage with people as they log on to the wireless network. So when you log on to, say, a public Wi-Fi, it gives you a brand, terms of service, it asks for your email, password, sign in with Facebook or something. And as soon as you do that, now you can capture that information. And then now you can maybe enhance the speed of the network or deliver some target marketing, some form of engagement with them. And then finally, you can do some forms of tracking because all of our access points and cameras can now understand the movement of people within that environment. So I'm going to show you a lot more than just slides. I like to do more demos in slideware. So let me just power through these just so you can kind of get the concept of what we're working with. So I showed you the use cases. These are the APIs that allow you to do it. So the Meraki dashboard API is kind of the core API here. That's going to give you all of the REST endpoints to do all of the moves and changes and statistics about your network. So we're going to explore that heavily in a second. The captive portal API, again, is just a splash page. So you connect to a Wi-Fi, ask for your name, a little bit of branding, terms of service, click a button, log in, you're good to go. Scanning API and BLE are slightly different. The scanning API basically uses Meraki access points. So imagine you have tons of stores, really big stores, and you have access points all over them. And now, instead of just offering Wi-Fi as like a free service, these access points can listen to all of your wireless clients on the network, right? So as soon as you turn on your phone, it's going to broadcast to join a wireless network, right? It sends out its MAC address and says, hello, everybody. I would like to join a network. Tell me what SSIDs are available. Well, Meraki access points will just take a note. We now know the MAC address. We know the time of day. We know the 2 APs or 3 APs that heard you, the signal strength for those APs, and now we can pinpoint exactly where you're at, how often you've been there, and how often you come back to that location. Kind of scary, actually. So that reminds me, GDPR and all the other regulations now didn't look too kindly on some of these technologies, although it has its place. So if I'm tracking high-value assets, I'm at like Media World or something, and I have displays of computers and equipment, I might want to attach a Bluetooth tag to that. And yes, I do want to track that thing everywhere it's at in my store. Or maybe a hospital, I can attach it to, say, an MRI machine that might be portable. You always know where that device is in your facility. Totally safe. Tracking people at a train station, a little bit creepier, right? So the way that we deal with that is the access points act as a beacon themselves. So they're just like a lighthouse. All it does is advertise an ID that says you are here, right? You are in zone 1, zone 1. And now your app is listening for the beacon. It hears the beacon that says, oh, I'm in zone 1, pull up local information about this. I could be at a museum, so it's going to pull up local information about the exhibit in my language, et cetera. Or I'm at a shopping mall. It knows that I'm in this area. I'm trying to get to the Lego store. I can now have turn-by-turn navigation, right? So Bluetooth is a more privacy-focused way of doing that. That's not to say that you can't configure the app to then send that information back to your own services, but at that point, they would have maybe logged into the app, accepted the terms of service for the location-aware services, and then you're good to go, right? And again, I'll show you some of that in a second. Webhooks is a new thing that we've added to the dashboard APIs. And in this way, we can alert you when there's a change to your network, right? So instead of you having to pull an API, say every 5 minutes, are my devices online, how many clients do I have connected, that can be really taxing for both sides of it, right? Your servers are consumed constantly pulling information. Our servers are consumed delivering this repeated information. So instead, we will call you, right? Don't call us, we'll call you. We'll send you a message when something changes. So someone's in there mucking around with the dashboard, you're going to get an alert that settings have changed. Or our camera detects movement in the server room, we're going to send you an alert that motion was detected, right? So now you can have a dynamic experience. And I say and more because we just released a new API called MV Sense. So our cameras will actually detect people in the frame, right? And it does this in real time using a machine learning algorithm built into the camera. And then we stream it using MQTT. So I'm glad I learned that with my Lego project, because now when we implemented this, I'm like, oh, I know that. And that actually is a local stream, high speed, from the camera to your local broker or your server, and then you do something with it, okay? So I'm going to show you how all of this works, and again, in just a second. So now that you know the APIs, I'll just walk through some of the little details, examples, and then I'm going to actually work with some demos here. So I'm sure a lot of you have seen Postman. Basically, I'm just showing you an example of the types of responses you can get while working with the dashboard API. It's a simple JSON-based API using gets, puts, posts, and deletes to send or pull JavaScript object notation, or your name value pairs, right? So you can do everything from listing out my orgs, my admins, my wireless configurations, or making those changes. So if you abstract it or you build something around it, you could build, like your own custom interface that basically allows you to enter a store number, bind that to a template, add some devices, and you're good to go. The person operating this does not have to be a network engineer, right? And the person who wrote this doesn't have to be a network engineer. But it facilitates, the network functioning and being configured easily without tying up. I would say a more seasoned engineer who's like, really? I have to create another network? I could be doing something more complicated. So you build these sorts of tools to accomplish that. The Captive Portal API, if we take a quick look at that, you'll see that it basically is a client who hits an access point. The AP is like, I've never seen you before. I send you up to the cloud. The cloud redirects you to a splash page. This can be as simple as an HTML JavaScript page that I can host on GitHub for free, right? It could be that simple. And that's ideal for the best effort. Like, I'm going to tell you you shouldn't do anything bad. You're going to check a box that says I won't do anything bad, and you'll get on with your day. Now, if you need to grant access for high security, right, this is the corporate network, and that way you would tie in a AAA server like Radius or OAuth with some other service. Then it will truly validate who you are, maybe send some two-factor auth, and get you on. So it says whatever you want it to be, if it's super simple or if you want it to be super secure. Kind of a visual of what that scanning API is. This is the location tracking one. And so this is basically going to use that same exact access point. It's listening for both Wi-Fi probes as well as Bluetooth probes, okay? And it also sends out Bluetooth probes. And in that way, now I can listen for these clients. They may have logged on with the captive portal. So as they logged on to the splash page, all right, I now know their MAC address, and I know their email and their name and whatever other option I asked. Now that I have that info, as they are walking around the facility, I can track that MAC address. And I know that that MAC address correlates with this email address, which means I know this person is going to the sporting goods options or the sporting goods section every time that they come here. I'm going to send them an advertisement about buying some football gear, right? That's generally how that mechanism could work. Or you can give them wayfinding or turn-by-turn instructions, right? So in this scenario, again, I just need to get to the elevator, or I need to find, a restroom or something. The reverse of it is very helpful in driving that sort of activity. And again, people already need Wi-Fi and switching and firewall for their systems to work. What Meraki is doing is just making it easier to manage, and we're giving you all these APIs so that you can kind of build your own services on top of it. Webhooks, I told you about the alerts, but that basically, this is what it would look like. It's JSON. We're going to just dump it to whatever web server that you have. Consider it like submitting a form on a web page. It's just a post. And we post to your server every time some event happens that you're interested in, right? And from there, you can create all the automation tasks. So let's hope the demo gods are my favorite here. We'll see what happens. So just as a quick sort of look, this is the Meraki dashboard. We have a lot of things going on here. So right now, this is just a topology. I'll zoom this in a little bit. Close that out. This is just a topology of our demo booth in the other area, right? So this is literally what's happening now. And I can prove that because I can go over to here, and I can look at the cameras, and I can start spying on people right now. OK, so those are the demo booths, and I'm actually looking at them, which is kind of cool. All right? But not only do we allow you to do this within the dashboard, I wanted to abstract this. So I'm going to show you a cool API that we are just now building. It was literally just released, and I've just started having a play with it. So what you can do is on a particular camera, right, you can go to the settings, and you can create specific zones. So imagine I want to highlight a particular area on the screen, right? Because I could have a camera looking at 3 different registers, right? So I could create zone 1, 2, and 3 for the different registers, right? Then I configure Sense. Sense is the feature which basically allows you to configure an MQTT broker, which will send real-time analytics to that server. So if I pull that up, I can, I'm using an automation tool called Node-RED. Anyone heard of Node-RED? Oh, you should. It's awesome. It's basically, it's an open source tool developed by IBM, actually, written with Node.js, with a visual editor basically built on top of it. You drop in nodes as if they're like functions or classes that do a set of tasks. So I can drop in like an express route for like, a get route. Then I can then extend that data, which would be a message object, throughout my flow, right? So in this scenario, I am actually using an MQTT broker, so it's running its own server. I am accepting everything, every topic that it is hearing, and I'm basically converting that string of payload data into JSON, so I'm just parsing it, really. And just to show you what that truly looks like, if I expand this out, and if I turn it on, my debugger, you'll see it's a ton of information. our cameras are sending this every couple of milliseconds, right? More than I can handle, more than I could look at. So I turn that off. But what I do is I send the message object through an RBE node. It's report by exception. It just basically says, only tell me if something changes. I don't want to hear, there's 5 people, 5 people, 5 people, 5 people. Just tell me if something changed, right? So that's all that does. So now that I have that information coming in, I can actually expand it out in the debugger over here. And you'll see that as I expand it out, you can basically see the object that I have. And in that object, it has an array of 7 people that it detected with the coordinates of the screen that they were on, right? So now I can see exactly where people are within the zones on the actual screen. So now that I have this big array of people data, what do I do with it? Well, what I'm doing is I send it to a workflow. I put a queue on it, 1 message every couple of seconds, right? And then all I do is I analyze that data. So this little object basically compares the payload.counts.person, right? And if I can see that I have 0, 1, 2, or 3 people, I know what I'm dealing with. So all I do is I just kind of pipe that out to a couple of different scenarios where I effectively just rewrite the payload to either nobody home or like medium density. It's just simply a string that I'm saying, okay, well, if it's 3, I'll consider that medium. That's all I'm doing here. Then I send that to another workflow. So in this example, I quickly created a Vue.js HTML frontend. I'm not sure if you know that one, but it's one of my more favorite frameworks. And it's super simple. I basically have a front end, but I created a socket.io connection to that because, again, I don't want to have to do REST commands for something streaming. So MQTT, a stream into my backend server. I then present an HTML JavaScript front end. Then that establishes a socket.io connection so that now I can stream the state of all of that density count. So that's what's going on there. But I wanted to take it a step farther. And so what I did is I got an IoT light bulb, right? And I take that exact same message stream. I break out the person count. But instead of applying a message, I apply a color. And that's what this little guy's about, right? So I can manually do it. So if I say, show me red, I push on red. It sends a command to red, right? Should. But I also have it tied, there we go. It's red, it's flickering around because it's also tied into my real camera system. So you saw there were real people there, so it changes based on the color of that. So that's truly how it's working. So same sort of concept. Now that I have these little connections, I can tie it to all sorts of things, right? So I've tied cameras into my Lego city, so when I come in there, certain lights turn on, I can have things going on. I'm working on a project where I have a little pony keg, right, or a little refrigerator. And my plan is if it detects me coming in, it's going to open the door, grab the beer, put it on the train, start the train, bring it around me, and play the music, right? That's the plan. That's the vision. We'll see if I can get there. I'm halfway there. I'm tying this into Spotify for music, right? So if it only sees like 1 or 2 people, it's going to play some classical music. 3 or 4, play some house music, right? 5 or 6, full-on disco, lights are changing, everything. Almost there. So that's one example of what you can do with some of the stream, right? I'll show just a couple of other, I would say, more practical examples. So again, we have our dashboard. You can configure it here. You then have Postman, where you can start manually sort of interacting with the dashboard, right? So if I wanted to say, list out list out all my networks in an organization, I would hit send to this endpoint. It's basically going to use my API key, and now I get a list of all of my networks in JSON, right? Pretty straightforward. Great for developing, great for testing. I mean, what is the user going to do with this, right? So I built a front-end application. I'll just start at the beginning here, where I was dealing with a service provider who did not want their third-party technicians and installers to have access to the proper dashboard. So I built out a proof of concept for a technician app in Vue. And you can imagine this is a progressive web app. This is a form factor, stores everything in browser storage. It's pretty slick, actually. And what you can do is now you can manage your network. So you can, again, I do an API call. I pull out all of my organizations. I do another API call to pull out all of my networks. From there, I can now access my wireless settings. I pull an API. I get a list of all of my wireless networks. And from there, I can say disable it, enable it, or I could change, the passcode. Now imagine I needed to do something more advanced. A technician comes to site. I hit admin mode. Boom, it expands it out. Now I've ungated all of these different endpoints that they can start interacting with, right? Pretty standard stuff here, but it's really powerful now because people can build their own solutions to fit their own needs, to do their own analysis on their devices. I'm just using the Google Maps API to pull that in, using the Meraki API, and using Vue.js to put it all together. Don't judge me too much on styling. CSS is not my strength. But I can make things talk to each other, right? So that's kind of I would say, one concept with a technician app. Another example, you might want to, again, create a captive portal. So I actually built one in Node-RED, but I've also written a few in, say, Angular and React and a couple others. But I like this one because I can show you in real time what's happening. So imagine let's see if I can actually show this in real time. All right. Duplicate. So what I'm actually going to do is, if you see to the left, this is simply a get route. Okay, so imagine I'm running Express or something like that. I have just exposed a route called /xcap-click. Means external captive portal click-through. Okay. All that basically means is if I add that to the end of my domain here, xcap-click, great. It's actually going to load up a web page. And I'm actually going to fill it in with some parameters. And so all that really did is I hit this endpoint. I then parse out what Meraki would be sending for the login URL, the access points, MAC address, the location of the network. We'll include that in the parameters when we redirect the customer to your web server. So I parse that out, and then I simply deliver an HTML page, right? It's really nothing more than just an HTML form, right? So I collect that information, and when they hit submit, it's effectively going to send it to this post node so that I can consume the login information and then process that login. So if I clear this out and maybe just refresh, and then I can say, fake news, test@test.com. I hit register, and now I would have logged in. Imagine this screen would have closed. Now they're on the internet. If I go over into Node-RED, you can actually see, I'll expand that out. That's the object that was actually created for their session, right? So now I can pull out the name, the email, the checkbox if they've accepted the terms, and from there I can trigger other actions. Maybe send an alert, send a marketing campaign, do whatever you want with it. A couple other cool things that you can do really with the APIs is I built this a couple of Google Sheets because I was getting tired of people asking me, can you build me a quick little JavaScript or a quick little Python script to generate a CSV file that has this set of information, right? You do that 1 or 2 times, it's fun. 3 or 4, I was getting bored. 5 or 6, I'm like, don't call me, right? Instead, I just cut to the point, and I've created a spreadsheet that simply has a script attached to it. Let me try that again. Script editor. There we go. So behind any Google Sheet, you can write a Google script, which is effectively JavaScript, but without the libraries. Discovered that the hard way. I had to write everything from scratch. But what that basically allows me to do is I created a simple menu for this Google Sheet. I have a number of API function calls, right? So you'll see the repetitiveness of this. All it's doing is it's fetching this particular URL with some parameters. That's all it's doing. Then it gets the response, parses it to JSON. Good. The next thing I do in this is I have all these report functions, right? So all I'm doing is kind of making the API call, like get inventory, and then for each one, these are JSON objects, right? So they're nested. There's properties of properties and all that. Doesn't fit nice in a spreadsheet. So what I have to do is I write this code to basically flatten the object, create different tabs if they're like completely different concepts, and then I basically extend out the columns. So in that way, I could say, I click down here, I say Meraki reports, give me a list of, say, all of my SSIDs. So now it's going to run through my entire organization, query every single network, pull out all the SSIDs, and then spit that out into a giant spreadsheet, right? Pretty cool. Now, again, you may not want to pull this information all the time. So what I did is I did it the opposite way. I've created a webhook-driven spreadsheet. And in that way, when you do it this way, you basically have a kind of a similar script, but all it really does is I have a post exception here. Let's see if I can find it. Do get, do post. All right. This is the core function right here. All it is something that waits for a post, right? I get that post, I parse out any of the parameters, and I display it on my spreadsheet. All the other code is me managing that JSON and shoving it into a spreadsheet. That's all this part here is some funkiness to figure that out. Now that I have that in there, you can see that I can dynamically update this spreadsheet with all the changes that happen in my network, all the uplink status changes. I even did a test where I put my network usage alert down to 10 megabits every minute. And then I started watching Netflix to see what would happen. And I was able to generate a lot of data really quickly. And so now I can have a dynamically updated graph based on alerts that are posted into my spreadsheet, right? And so this is great from sales guys, network engineers, anybody who just needs to understand, audit their network, show some stuff around. And we build all of these tools for free, basically. So on our Meraki.io site, this is our developer portal where you can get access to all of this code, right? It's all open source, a lot of JavaScript, a lot of Python in there, amongst other like random services, right? So I just showed you a couple. So if you were bored and you wanted to play with this later, you could type in Google Sheets, and you'll see that I have both of them in there, as well as how you would integrate them. I also have some pretty cool things where maybe you want to tie in with, like, say, ServiceNow. I actually did a whole case study where I built out an integration into this third-party management platform. I used AngularJS for this one. And so now I'm writing an Angular app that basically allows you to create a network, bind it to a template, add devices, rinse and repeat. But I also show you the thought process around how I made it, right? So what were the API calls? Like, first, list the organization, so I list that here. Then get the templates, then create the network, then bind it, then show my information, then trigger the devices, add the license, add the serial, select the device, rinse and repeat, right? So I show you exactly all the endpoints that you would need to accomplish said goal, and then I really go into the details of how I wrote this. I don't do Angular every day, so I'm sure there's some room for improvement, but I learned a lot about observables and other random things. So I got that. Some pretty cool stuff inside of there. I just have like 1 or 2 minutes left, so I just wanted to also say my Internet of Lego site. Now, this is not Meraki, but just for me. Internet of Lego, again, this is where I learned a lot, right? So if you want tutorials about how I just connect the things, this is a great place to start. Everything, again, from proper Meraki APIs to random gadgets. I even took my daughter's little basketball thing. I put a little ultrasonic sound sensor in there, and so if the ball passes through it, I count it as a goal. And so then I built a little Lego scoreboard at the top, and then I synced that to the internet so that I could keep tallies of my scores over time. I don't know why I do these things. So that's basically the idea. I think 2:50 was my time limit here. So last minute, was there any key questions? All right. If not, our booth is just really at the main entrance there. I'm happy to go into more detail about any of these. It's going to be a lot of fun. If you guys want to play with this, you're more than happy. We have a sandbox. As well as if you watch a webinar on Meraki.com, we'll send you a free access point, right? So it's probably worth your time if you really do want to start building things and kind of expanding your development career as it applies to networking. All right? Thank you, guys.